"You're fired, Emma. I need your desk cleared by the end of the day." Those 9 words shattered my world after a decade of loyal service. I stood there, stunned, as my boss, the man I had helped build an empire, dismissed me without even looking up from his computer screen. 10 years of sacrifices, late nights, missed birthdays, and putting the company ahead of everything else. Gone in seconds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But what my boss, Richard Westfield, didn't know that day was that 6 months earlier, through an anonymous holding company, I had purchased the entire office building where Westfield Solutions had been operating for the past 15 years. And it wasn't just any building. It was the crown jewel of downtown Portland, the cornerstone of Richard's image as a successful tech CEO. Sometimes the universe has a way of setting up the perfect revenge without you even planning it. I still remember the first day I walked into Westfield Solutions. It was 2013, and I was 26, bright-eyed, and ready to change the world with custom software solutions. Richard had just started the company 2 years earlier, and back then, it was only him and 4 employees crammed into a tiny office with mismatched furniture and a coffee machine that worked about half the time. "Emma Davis," Richard had said, extending his hand with that charismatic smile that would convince hundreds of clients to trust us over the years. "I've heard impressive things about your work at Techlite. Welcome aboard." I had given up a stable position at a much larger company because I believed in Richard's vision. He talked about building solutions that actually helped small businesses compete against corporate giants. He talked about creating a workplace where people were valued above profit margins. And most importantly, he made me feel like I would be an integral part of building something meaningful. "We'll be partners in this," he had promised during my interview. "Not in the legal sense, but in every way that matters. I need someone who can take my ideas and make them happen." For years, that's exactly what I did. I was the second in command, the one who translated Richard's often brilliant but chaotic ideas into executable plans. I built the technical team from the ground up, personally interviewing every developer we hired. I stayed until midnight coding alongside them when deadlines loomed. I was the one who calmed clients when projects ran behind schedule, and who pushed back when Richard's promises exceeded what was technically possible. Westfield Solutions grew rapidly. By year 3, we had 20 employees. By year 5, 50. Our client list expanded from local Portland businesses to national accounts. We moved from that tiny office to a full floor in the Burton Building, one of the most prestigious addresses in downtown. "This is how people know we've made it," Richard said the day we moved in, gesturing around the sleek reception area with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. "Location is everything, Emma. Perception is reality." I remember nodding, thinking about how the lease would stretch our operational budget dangerously thin, but Richard insisted the address alone would bring in bigger clients, and he was right. Within months, we landed 3 major accounts simply because our address gave us credibility that our competitors lacked. Through it all, I remained Richard's right hand. When he traveled to speak at conferences, I ran the company. When potential clients needed detailed technical explanations, I gave presentations while Richard charmed them over expensive dinners. When difficult decisions had to be made about cutting underperforming projects, I was the one who had to tell teams their work was being shelved. "You're the backbone of this place," Richard would tell me, usually after I had pulled off some minor miracle to save a troubled project. "I couldn't do this without you, Emma." I believed him. I believed in us, the unstoppable duo building something special in the tech industry. I turned down job offers from Silicon Valley giants with double the salary. I delayed starting a family, broke off a serious relationship that would have required relocating, and missed my grandmother's final days because we were in the middle of our biggest product launch. The company was my life, my identity, my future, until it wasn't. The signs were subtle at first. Around the 8-year mark, Richard began holding executive meetings without me. When I asked about them later, he would wave a hand dismissively and say, "Just boring financial stuff, nothing you need to worry about." Then came the hiring of James Thornton as Chief Strategy Officer, a position that had never existed before and seemed to overlap significantly with my responsibilities. James was fresh from a Silicon Valley startup that had been acquired for an impressive sum. He had slicked back hair, custom suits, and a way of talking that made everything sound like a TED Talk. "James brings a different perspective," Richards explained when I questioned the need for the position. "We're at a different level now, Emma. We need to play by different rules." The different rules apparently included James accompanying Richard to client meetings that I would have typically attended. It meant James presenting new product roadmaps that I hadn't been consulted on. It meant watching my influence in the company I had helped build slowly erode like a coastline in a rising tide. I tried to adapt. I reached out to James, suggesting, "We collaborate on strategic initiatives." His responses were always polite but vague. "Let's definitely sync up soon," he would say, but soon never seemed to arrive. I scheduled more one-on-one time with Richard, bringing concrete suggestions for new service offerings based on what I was hearing from our development teams. He would listen, nod appreciatively, then ultimately go with whatever direction James had suggested. Then came the reorganization. On a company-wide Zoom call, Richard announced a new structure that placed James at the head of a newly formed innovation division that would encompass most of our product development, effectively moving 2/3 of the employees who had previously reported to me under James's authority. My new title was Director of Legacy Systems, a demotion disguised as a lateral move. I would be responsible for maintaining our older products while James's team focused on the exciting new development work. After the call, I went straight to Richard's office, not bothering to hide my anger or hurt. "Legacy systems? Really, Richard? Why not just call it Obsolete Technology Department?" Richard leaned back in his chair, regarding me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Emma, this isn't a demotion. These are systems you've built and know better than anyone. Who else could I trust to maintain them?" "You know that's not the point," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've been systematically pushing me out for months now. What I can't figure out is why." He sighed, rubbing his temples as if I was giving him a headache. "The company is evolving, Emma. We're preparing for potential acquisition offers. Major players are looking at us, and they want to see a certain kind of leadership structure. And I don't fit into that structure? After 10 years? It's not about fitting in. It's about presenting the right image to potential buyers. James has experience with acquisitions. He speaks their language. And I don't speak the right language? I've only built half the products this company sells." Richard stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I need you to be a team player here, Emma. This is happening whether you like it or not. The question is whether you're going to help make it a success or become an obstacle." I left his office that day with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The partnership Richard had promised a decade ago had been nothing more than a convenient fiction. I was a tool, useful until I wasn't, disposable when something shinier came along. But I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The company still meant too much to me, and I believed in what we had built together. So I swallowed my pride, accepted my reduced role, and tried to find purpose in maintaining the legacy systems that were still generating substantial revenue. For the next few months, I threw myself into improving those systems, making them more efficient and stable than they had ever been. I documented everything meticulously, trained junior developers on the intricacies of the code base, and even identified several ways to extend the product life cycles that I presented to Richard in detailed reports. He barely glanced at them. "Looks good, Emma. Keep up the good work," he would say before turning back to whatever email or report had his attention. Meanwhile, James's innovation division announced a series of new products with great fanfare, complete with glossy marketing materials and company-wide celebration events. I attended these events with a fixed smile, congratulating team members I had personally hired years earlier, while feeling increasingly invisible. It was during this time that an unusual opportunity presented itself. I had maintained a friendship with Olivia Chen, who had been Westfield's first office manager before leaving to start her own commercial real estate firm. We met monthly for coffee, and during one of these meetups, she mentioned that Morris Holdings, the company that owned the Burton Building, was looking to divest some of their downtown properties. "The Burton is on the list," Olivia said, stirring her latte. "They've owned it for over 20 years and want to focus on residential developments now. It's not officially on the market yet, but they're entertaining private offers." I nearly choked on my coffee. "The entire building? What kind of price are they looking at?" Olivia named a figure that made my eyebrows shoot up. It was substantial, far more than I had in liquid assets, but not entirely out of reach when I considered my stock options, savings, and the inheritance my grandmother had left me. "Would they consider an investor group?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Olivia gave me a curious look. "Possibly. Are you interested? I didn't know you were into commercial real estate." "I'm not, usually," I said, "but I know that building intimately. And investment diversification is always smart, right?" What I didn't tell Olivia was the idea forming in my mind. If Richard valued image and prestigious addresses so highly, what would it mean if I owned the very building that projected that image? Not as leverage, I wasn't thinking that far ahead yet, but as a small way of reclaiming some control in a situation where I felt increasingly powerless. "Let me make some calls," Olivia said. "No promises, but I'll see if they'd entertain." An offer from a small investment group. 2 weeks later, Olivia connected me with the Morris Holdings executive handling the sale. I created Anderson Capital LLC, named after my grandmother, as the investment vehicle. With Olivia's help, I brought in 2 other silent investors, former tech executives I had worked with who were looking to diversify their portfolios, and secured financing for the remainder. The negotiations were intense, but the timing worked in our favor. Commercial real estate was experiencing a temporary downturn, and Morris Holdings was motivated to sell quickly. Within 2 months, Anderson Capital LLC owned the Burton Building, and I was the majority stakeholder. I didn't tell anyone at Westfield Solutions, not even my closest colleagues. As far as they knew, the building had changed hands to an anonymous investment group, a common enough occurrence in commercial real estate that it raised no eyebrows. The management company remained the same, and day-to-day operations continued, unchanged. For a while, I took a strange comfort in my secret. When Richard would stride through the lobby, nodding approvingly at the marble floors and sleek furnishings, I would smile to myself, knowing that he was admiring something that was partially mine. During difficult meetings where my input was ignored, I would think about the lease agreement in my home safe with Westfield Solutions' name on the tenant line and my company's name on the landlord line. It was childish, perhaps, but it helped me cope with my diminishing role at the company I had helped build. Then came the final blow. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had spent the morning troubleshooting an issue with one of our largest clients, systems. I had just sent off the solution when my calendar pinged with a meeting invitation. Emma plus Richard, 4:30 p.m., Richard's office. No agenda, no explanation. Just a short meeting at the end of the day. I knew. Somehow, I just knew what was coming. I spent the rest of the afternoon in a strange state of calm, methodically organizing my digital files, updating handover documents I had been preparing just in case, and sending a few emails to team members, thanking them for their recent work. At 4:28 p.m., I walked to Richard's corner office, knocked once, and entered when he called out. He wasn't alone. Linda from HR sat in one of the chairs opposite his desk, a manila folder in her hands. Richard himself was staring at his computer screen, typing something as I entered. "Have a seat, Emma," he said without looking up. I sat in the empty chair beside Linda, who gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile. Richard finished whatever he was typing, then finally looked at me. His expression was neutral, professional, the face he used for difficult client conversations. "Emma, I'll get right to the point. As part of our continued restructuring, we've been reviewing all departments for efficiency and strategic alignment. With our new direction." I almost smiled at the corporate jargon. This wasn't Richard speaking. These were lines someone had prepared for him, probably James. "After careful consideration," he continued, "we've determined that the Legacy Systems Division would function more efficiently as part of the broader technical support department. This means your position as director is being eliminated." There it was. 10 years of dedication reduced to an eliminated position. I waited for more, some acknowledgement of our history, some recognition of all I had contributed, but Richard simply nodded to Linda, who slid the folder across the desk. Toward me, "Linda has prepared a separation package," Richard said. "It includes 2 months severance, continuation of benefits through the end of the quarter, and details about your vested stock options. Your company laptop and access credentials will need to be surrendered today." He finally met my eyes directly. "I want to thank you for your years of service, Emma. You've been an important part of Westfield Solutions' growth." The past tense stung more than anything else. "That's it?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. 10 years? And that's all you have to say?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "This is a business decision, Emma. It's not personal." I laughed then, a short, sharp sound that made Linda flinch beside me. "Not personal. Richard, I've missed holidays with my family for this company. I ended a relationship because my partner didn't understand why the company always came first. I've worked 80-hour weeks when needed. And you're telling me it's not personal?" "Emma," he began, a warning tone in his voice. "No, let me finish. You promised me we were building something together. You told me I was indispensable. Was any of that true? Or was I just a convenient stepping stone until someone like James came along?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I think this conversation is getting emotional in a way that's not productive. The decision has been made. Linda can walk you through the details of your separation package if you have questions." "You're fired, Emma," he added, turning back to his computer screen. "I need your desk cleared by the end of the day." And there they were, those 9 words that changed everything. I should have felt devastated. I should have been angry. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Relief, followed by a calm certainty that had eluded me for months. Without a word, I picked up the folder, stood, and walked out of his office. At my desk, I methodically packed my personal items into a cardboard box provided by the IT staff member who had been sent to supervise my departure and collect my laptop. 10 years of my life fit into one medium-sized box, a few framed photos, a plant that had somehow survived my erratic watering schedule, a collection of conference lanyards I had kept as souvenirs, and a handful of trinkets gifted by grateful clients over the years. As I packed, colleagues walked by, some stopping to ask what was happening, others averting their eyes when they realized I was being let go. A few of my closest team members came to express shock and dismay, offering to meet for drinks later, to commiserate. I accepted their condolences with the same strange calm that had settled over me, promising to stay in touch but saying little about my feelings on the matter. By 6:15 p.m., I had turned in my badge, signed the necessary paperwork, and walked out of the Burton building carrying my box of belongings. Only then, standing on the sidewalk in the fading evening light, did I allow myself a smile. Richard thought he had taken everything from me, but he had actually set me free, and he still had no idea who his landlord was. The next morning, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. I made coffee, sat on my balcony overlooking the city, and opened my laptop, my personal one, not the company machine I had been required to surrender. I had 2 important emails to send. The first was to my lawyer, asking him to review Westfield Solutions' lease agreement and identify any provisions related to building renovations, rent adjustments, or tenant improvements that might be relevant in the coming months. The second was to Olivia. "Olivia," I wrote, "I'd like to schedule a meeting with you in your capacity as the property manager for the Burton building. It's time for Anderson Capital to become a more active owner, and I have some ideas for improvements that will require tenant cooperation. Also, could you send me the full details of Westfield Solutions' lease? I should have reviewed it more carefully before now." As I hit send, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: excitement. Richard had taught me many lessons over the years, but perhaps the most valuable was one he never intended to share. That power doesn't come from a title or an office. It comes from ownership, from controlling the things that others merely use. He had fired the employee, but he still had to deal with the landlord, and I was just getting started. The coffee tasted better than usual that morning as I sat watching the sun climb over the city, illuminating the Burton building in the distance. My building, my future, on my terms. Sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a much better story. People assume revenge is a dish best served immediately. They're wrong. The best revenge unfolds like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each movement building upon the last until the finale leaves everyone breathless. I spent the first week after my termination doing absolutely nothing related to Westfield Solutions or Richard. Instead, I hiked in Forest Park, took a pottery class I'd been putting off for years, slept in past 7 a.m., and reconnected with friends who had gotten used to my perpetual rain checks. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from former colleagues expressing outrage at my firing, offering job referrals, or simply checking on my well-being. I responded graciously but vaguely to all of them. Taking some time to consider my next steps became my mantra. In reality, I was mentally preparing for the game that was about to begin. On day 8 of my post-Westfield life, I drove to a small law office in a converted Victorian house on the east side of Portland. Morgan Reynolds had been my grandmother's attorney for decades before becoming mine. At 72, she could have retired years ago, but still maintained a select client list that she served with razor-sharp legal acumen. "Emma," she said, rising from behind her desk with a warm smile that quickly transformed into a frown. "You look exhausted." "Unemployed, actually," I replied, settling into the worn leather chair opposite her. After 10 years, Richard Westfield decided my services were no longer required. Morgan's eyebrows shot up. "Westfield? The man you helped build a company from scratch? The one you've defended to me for years whenever I suggested he was taking advantage of your loyalty?" I winced at the accuracy of her assessment. That would be the one. She sat back down, clasping her hands on her desk. "Well, I've never been so disappointed to be right. What happened?" I gave her the condensed version, the gradual sidelining, James Thornton's arrival, my relegation to legacy systems, and finally, the unceremonious termination. Morgan listened without interruption, but I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. When I finished, she nodded once. "And now you're here, which means you're not just looking for sympathy." I smiled. This was why I valued Morgan. She never wasted time on pleasantries when there was business to discuss. "You remember Anderson Capital? The LLC you formed to purchase the Burton building? Of course. I still have questions about why a software executive suddenly decided to invest in commercial real estate, by the way." "Well, now you have your answer," I said. Westfield Solutions is the anchor tenant in the Burton building, occupying 3 full floors. Richard has no idea that I'm effectively his landlord. Morgan stared at me for a long moment before a slow smile spread across her face. Emma Davis, you magnificent Machiavellian. You saw this coming, didn't you? Not exactly, I admitted. I knew something was changing, but I didn't expect to be fired. Buying the building was more about regaining some control when I felt like I was losing it at work. A psychological hedge, I suppose. And now? Now I'd like to review every detail of Westfield's lease agreement and understand exactly what rights I have as the building owner. Morgan pulled out a legal pad. What's your objective here? Financial compensation? Forcing them out? Personal satisfaction? It was a good question, one I had been asking myself for days. What did I really want? I want Richard to understand the true cost of discarding people who have been loyal to him, I said finally. I want him to realize that I was more valuable than he knew. And yes, I want financial compensation for the years of undervalued work and broken promises. But not destruction, I added. There are 58 people working at Westfield who had nothing to do with my firing. I don't want to hurt them. Morgan nodded, jotting notes. Calibrated pressure then. Let's see what we have to work with. For the next 3 hours, we pored over the lease agreement, building regulations, and Portland commercial real estate ordinances. By the time I left Morgan's office, we had identified several promising avenues to explore. The lease had been signed 5 years earlier when Westfield Solutions was rapidly expanding. Richard, ever the optimist, had committed to a 10-year term with substantial penalties for early termination. The agreement included a clause allowing for rent adjustments, based on market rates every 3 years, meaning we were overdue for a review. Additionally, as the building owner, I had considerable latitude regarding renovation schedules, utility management, and common area modifications. None of these things individually would create major problems for Westfield, but collectively, they could certainly make Richard's life more complicated. Remember, Morgan cautioned as I was leaving, the goal is pressure, not illegality. Everything we do must be defensible as normal business operations. I assured her I understood the line. This wasn't about breaking laws. It was about using them to my advantage. My next meeting was with Olivia at her downtown office. As both my friend and the property manager for the Burton building, she was in a unique position to help, but I needed to be careful about how much I revealed. Emma! She greeted me with a hug. I'm still in shock about Westfield. What an absolute jerk move after everything you've done for that company. Thanks, Olivia. I'm still processing it myself. She led me to her office, a bright space with architectural drawings and property photos covering one wall. So, about your email, you're ready to take a more active role in managing the Burton? Very much so, I replied, settling into a chair. Starting with a thorough understanding of our tenants, especially Westfield Solutions. Olivia gave me a curious look but didn't push. Instead, she pulled out a thick folder. I've brought everything: the original lease, all amendments, maintenance records, tenant improvement requests. What specifically are you looking for? Let's start with the maintenance records, I said. Have there been any persistent issues with the Westfield offices? For the next hour, Olivia walked me through the building's systems and Westfield's history as a tenant. I learned that the HVAC system serving their floors was aging and had required increasingly frequent repairs. Over the past year, the elevator bank closest to their main entrance had been causing complaints due to slow response times during peak hours. Most interestingly, Richard had been pushing for a significant renovation of the reception area and executive offices, AE, requests that had been pending approval from the new owners. He's been quite persistent about it, Olivia said, showing me the email chain. Claims it's essential for their client-facing image. I remembered Richard's words from years ago. Location is everything, Emma. Perception is reality. How perfectly appropriate that his perception was about to change. "What would happen if we delayed that renovation approval?" I asked casually. "Just until we complete a more thorough assessment of the building's needs?" Olivia shrugged. "Technically, we could delay indefinitely. The lease gives the owner final approval on all structural modifications. Richard won't be happy, though. He's been telling clients about the upcoming executive suite upgrade for months." I murmured, making a note. "And what about the HVAC system? If we needed to do major repairs, what would that entail?" "Potentially shutting down sections of the system during work hours," Olivia replied. "We'd provide temporary alternatives, of course, but it wouldn't be as comfortable." "Why?" "Are you thinking of accelerating the replacement schedule?" "Just weighing our options," I said. "As a new owner, I want to ensure everything is in top condition, even if that means some temporary inconvenience." By the time I left Olivia's office, I had a much clearer picture of the Burton Building's operations, and more importantly, of Richard's vulnerabilities. His company's image was inextricably tied to their prestigious address and office aesthetics. Any disruption to that image would cause him considerable distress, especially with potential acquisition partners visiting. I spent the next week gathering more information. Through LinkedIn messages and coffee meetings with former colleagues, I learned that Westfield was indeed in acquisition talks with Meridian Tech, a Silicon Valley giant looking to expand their enterprise software portfolio. James Thornton, unsurprisingly, was leading these negotiations, with Richard serving as the charismatic company figurehead. The timing was perfect. If Westfield was trying to impress potential buyers, they would be particularly sensitive to any issues with their physical space or company image. But I needed more than just leverage. I needed my own path forward. Richard had taken my job, but he hadn't taken my expertise or my reputation in the industry. For the first time in a decade, I was free to consider what I actually wanted, not just what would benefit Westfield Solutions. The answer came during a call with Deanna Wong, a former client who had moved to a healthcare software startup called MediSync. We had stayed in touch over the years, and she reached out after hearing about my departure from Westfield. "Emma, I won't pretend this is just a sympathy call," Deanna said after the initial pleasantries. "We've been trying to build out a secure patient data platform for months, and our technical team is struggling. Your name came up in a leadership meeting yesterday when we were discussing potential consultants." "Consulting?" I repeated, the idea taking root immediately. I hadn't considered that route. "You should. Your reputation in the industry is stellar. Half the CTOs in Portland would hire you on your name alone." She paused. "Unless you're already looking at other full-time positions?" "Actually, consulting might be perfect," I said, my mind racing with possibilities. "I've been thinking about what's next, and the idea of being tied to a single company again doesn't hold the appeal. It once did." By the end of our call, I had a verbal agreement to consult for MediSync 3 days a week for the next month, with the potential for an expanded engagement afterward. The pay was excellent, substantially better than my Westfield salary on an hourly basis, and the work would use my strengths without requiring the total life commitment I had given to Richard's company. More importantly, consulting would give me the flexibility to manage my other project, Anderson Capital and the Burton Building. 2 weeks after my termination, I was ready to implement the first phase of my plan. I scheduled a meeting with Morgan to finalize the details. "We'll start with a formal notice of rent review," Morgan explained, sliding a document across her desk. "The lease permits an adjustment to market rates, which have increased approximately 12% since the last assessment. It's completely standard procedure. Nothing Richard could reasonably object to." "And the renovation requests?" I asked. "We're sending a formal letter explaining that all tenant improvements are on hold pending a comprehensive structural assessment of the building." Again, completely reasonable from a property management perspective, especially with a new owner. We'll recommend they delay any announcements to clients about the executive suite upgrades." I nodded, scanning the carefully worded letter. "What about the HVAC and elevator maintenance?" "That's where we need to be careful," Morgan cautioned. "We're scheduling necessary maintenance, but we need documentation showing these systems genuinely require attention. Otherwise, it could appear targeted." "Olivia has provided the maintenance records," I assured her. "The work is legitimately needed. The timing is simply convenient." Morgan smiled thinly. "Convenient indeed. And you're certain about handling the in-person meeting with Richard yourself? I could send an associate." I shook my head. "No, this I need to do personally. Not as Emma Davis, former employee, but as E.A. Anderson, managing partner of Anderson Capital. He'll recognize you immediately." "That's the point," I said. "I want to see his face when he realizes who his landlord is." The pieces were falling into place. While Richard and James focused on impressing Meridian Tech, they would suddenly find themselves dealing with building issues, potential rent increases, and denied renovation requests, all managed by the person they had so carelessly discarded. But I wasn't just planning complications for Westfield. Simultaneously, I was building my new consulting business. After MediSync, 2 more clients signed on: a local credit union needing security upgrades and a retail analytics company looking to redesign their back-end systems. Within a month of being fired, I was earning more than I had at Westfield, working fewer hours, and controlling my own schedule. I also began reconnecting with the technical talent in Portland. Over lunches and coffee meetings, I casually mentioned my new consulting practice and listened to the current challenges at various companies, including Westfield Solutions. "Morale is in the toilet," Marcus, one of my former team leads, confided during our lunch. "After you left, they moved all the legacy systems work to technical support, just like Richard said they would. But nobody in support has the depth of knowledge needed. They're drowning in tickets, and client complaints have doubled." "What about James and his innovation division?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Marcus snorted. 3 delayed releases in a row. James keeps changing requirements mid-development, and the team is burning out. Richard's barely in the office anymore. He's too busy courting Meridian Tech with James. I nodded sympathetically while mentally filing away this information. Westfield was already struggling without me, not because I was irreplaceable, but because Richard had dismantled systems that worked without understanding why they worked. The next piece of my plan involved establishing my presence in the industry as an independent force, not just an extension of Richard Westfield. I reached out to several industry publications pitching articles on software architecture and technical leadership. 2 accepted immediately, likely due to my association with Westfield's success. I was careful in these articles to never mention Richard or my former company directly. Instead, I wrote about the principles that had guided my work for years. Principles that Richard had often claimed as his own in press interviews. Anyone familiar with Westfield Solutions would recognize these ideas and connect them to me rather than to Richard, subtly shifting the narrative about who had been the true technical visionary. While building my independent reputation, I was equally focused on the Burton building situation. True to our plan, Morgan sent the formal notices to Westfield Solutions regarding the rent review, renovation delay, and upcoming maintenance work. The communications were addressed to the facilities manager, not to Richard directly, ensuring they would work their way through the company bureaucracy before reaching his attention. It took exactly 8 days for Richard to call the property management office demanding to speak with someone about these notices. Olivia, playing her role perfectly, explained that the building had new ownership and scheduled a meeting for him with E.A. Anderson, managing partner, for the following week. The day before the meeting, I met Olivia for coffee to finalize the details. "Everything's set for tomorrow," she confirmed. Richard's assistant called twice to confirm. He's bringing James Thornton with him. I raised an eyebrow. "James, too? That's interesting." Is it going to be a problem? No, I said, smiling. It's actually perfect. James should see this too. Olivia hesitated, then asked the question I knew had been bothering her. Emma, I understand why you bought the building now, and I don't blame you for using your position as owner to protect your interests. But what's the end game here? What do you actually want? It was a fair question, one I had been refining in my own mind over the past weeks. I want recognition, I said finally. Not public acknowledgement or a formal apology, but I want Richard to truly understand what he threw away. I want him to realize that I was always more valuable than he knew, not just as an employee, but as a person. I paused, organizing my thoughts. Beyond that, I want fair compensation for the value I created. Richard promised me we were building something together, but in the end, he kept everything. There's a financial imbalance there that needs correction. And how will making his office uncomfortable achieve that? Olivia asked, not critically but genuinely curious. It won't, not directly, but it changes the power dynamic for our eventual negotiation. Right now, Richard thinks he holds all the cards. He fired me, cut me out completely, and expects me to fade away. I need to reshape his understanding of our relative positions before we can have any meaningful discussion about fair compensation. Olivia nodded slowly. And if he refuses to negotiate? If he decides to break the lease and move the company elsewhere despite the penalties? I smiled. I've considered that possibility. In fact, I've calculated the exact financial impact of the lease termination penalties on Westfield's balance sheet. It would be substantial, possibly enough to derail the Meridian Tech acquisition. Richard won't risk that. The next morning, I arrived at the Burton building 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. I wore a charcoal gray suit I had never worn to Westfield, one I had purchased specifically for my new role as E.A. Anderson property owner. My hair was styled differently, and I wore glasses I normally reserved for working late nights on code. Small changes, but enough to create a psychological separation between Emma, the former employee, and E.A. Anderson, the building owner. I entered. Through the service entrance, avoiding the main lobby where I might be recognized by former colleagues, and took the freight elevator to the management office on the second floor. Olivia was waiting with a conference room prepared. Water, coffee, the lease documents arranged neatly on the table. Nervous? She asked as I checked my reflection one last time. Excited, I corrected her. For 10 years, Richard controlled every interaction between us. Today, the dynamic shifts. At exactly 10 wows a.m., Olivia's assistant knocked on the door. Mr. Westfield and Mr. Thornton have arrived. I took my seat at the head of the conference table, arranged my documents, and nodded to Olivia. Show them in, please. Richard entered first, exuding the confident energy that had convinced so many clients to trust him over the years. James followed, looking slightly impatient, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Neither of them looked at me immediately, their eyes scanning the room, assessing the situation before making contact. When Richard finally turned toward me, his confident smile froze. I watched the progression of emotions cross his face: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, caution. "Emma?" he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" "Are you working for the building management now?" I smiled, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "Not exactly, Richard. I'm E.A. Anderson, managing partner of Anderson Capital LLC. We own the Burton building." James frowned, looking between Richard and me. "Wait, you two know each other?" Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Emma was our director of legacy systems before the reorganization. Emma, this is James Thornton, Chief Strategy Officer," I finished for him. "I'm well aware. Please, both of you, have a seat. We have several matters to discuss regarding your tenancy." For a moment, Richard seemed frozen, uncertain how to proceed. This wasn't a scenario he had prepared for, and I could almost see him recalculating his approach. Finally, he sat directly opposite me, with James taking the chair to his right. "I have to say, this is unexpected," Richard said, regaining his composure. "How long have you been involved with Anderson Capital?" "I founded the company approximately 6 months ago," I replied, keeping my tone professional, "specifically to acquire this building." The implication was clear. I had purchased the building while still employed at Westfield, anticipating something like this might happen. It wasn't entirely accurate. I hadn't expected to be fired, but the misunderstanding would work to my advantage. Richard's expression darkened. 6 months ago? While you were still at Westfield? That seems like a significant conflict of interest. I met his gaze evenly. No more conflicted than pushing out the person who built half your product line to make room for a more acquisition-friendly executive team. James shifted uncomfortably beside Richard. "Look, Ms. Davis." "Anderson is fine for this meeting," I interrupted. "Ms. Anderson, then," James continued, his tone conciliatory. "Whatever happened between you and Westfield is separate from your role as property owner. We're here to discuss practical matters regarding our lease and the recent notices we've received." "Of course," I agreed, opening my folder. "Let's start with the renovation requests for your executive suite. After reviewing the structural assessment needs of the building, we've determined that no major tenant improvements can be approved for at least 6 months. Richard leaned forward. 6 months? That's completely unacceptable. We've already announced these upgrades to clients. We have the budget allocated. Delaying half a year would seriously impact our business operations. I understand your concern, I said, echoing the same phrase he had used countless times when dismissing my input. Unfortunately, the structural integrity of the building must take priority. I'm sure your clients will understand that safety comes first. Richard's face flushed slightly. He recognized his own tactics being used against him. What about the HVAC system? James interjected, clearly trying to move the conversation forward. The notice mentioned significant work that would affect our floors. Yes, I confirmed, sliding the maintenance reports across the table. The system servicing your floors is overdue for major repairs. Unfortunately, this will require shutdown of climate control for approximately 3 days on each floor, sequentially. We'll provide portable units, of course, but they won't maintain the same level of comfort. And when exactly is this work scheduled? Richard asked, his voice tight. I consulted my calendar with deliberate slowness. We're looking at next week for the first floor, the following week for the second, and the week after for the executive level. That's when we have the Meridian Tech executive team visiting, James blurted out, then immediately looked like he regretted the admission. Is it? I asked innocently. I had no idea. Unfortunately, the contractors are already scheduled, and rearranging their workflow would incur significant additional costs. Richard's eyes narrowed. Costs that could perhaps be negotiated? And there it was, the opening I had been waiting for. Richard was acknowledging that there was room for negotiation, not just about building maintenance, but potentially about our larger situation. Perhaps, I conceded, though any such negotiation would need to encompass all aspects of our relationship. Richard studied me for a long moment, understanding dawning in his eyes. This wasn't just about building maintenance or renovation, approvals. This was about setting the terms for a larger conversation. I think, he said carefully, that we should schedule a private meeting to discuss these matters more comprehensively. Just the two of us. James looked surprised. Richard, shouldn't I be involved in— Not for this, James. Richard cut him off. Ms. Anderson and I have a history that predates your time with the company. I think we can resolve this more efficiently without additional parties. I nodded, maintaining my professional demeanor despite the satisfaction I felt. I think that would be wise. Shall we say tomorrow morning? My office, not yours. Richard hesitated, then nodded. 9 a.m.? 9 a.m., I confirmed, closing my folder. Now, regarding the rent review mentioned in our notice. The rest of the meeting proceeded with tense professionalism. We discussed the legitimate building issues that needed addressing, with Richard and James reluctantly acknowledging the necessity of the work while trying to negotiate more favorable scheduling. I gave small concessions where reasonable, agreeing to conduct the noisiest work outside business hours and ensuring the elevator maintenance wouldn't coincide with major client meetings, while holding firm on the larger issues like the renovation delay and rent review. When the meeting concluded an hour later, James left immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Richard lingered, waiting until we were alone in the conference room. "You planned this," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization. "Not all of it," I admitted. "I didn't plan to be fired. But I did plan for the possibility that our professional relationship might change." Richard nodded slowly. "Always 3 steps ahead. That's why you were so valuable." "Were?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Are," he corrected, holding my gaze. "Tomorrow at 9 then." As he turned to leave, I called after him. "Richard, bring the company financials. All of them, not just the versions you show to the board." He paused at the door, looking back with a mixture of resignation and respect. "You really don't miss anything, do you?" "That's why I was so valuable," I replied, using his own words. "See you tomorrow." After he left, I sat alone in the conference room, the tension of the meeting finally releasing from my shoulders. Phase 1 was complete. Richard understood that I held significant leverage and was willing to negotiate. More importantly, he recognized that I was no longer the loyal employee who could be dismissed with a brief meeting and a manila folder. Tomorrow, we would begin the real conversation about compensation, recognition, and moving forward. Richard thought he had taken everything from me, but instead, he had inadvertently handed me the power to reshape our relationship on my terms. Sometimes getting fired is just the beginning of discovering your true value. I arrived at my office an hour early the next morning, giving myself time to prepare both mentally and physically for my meeting with Richard. The space itself was new, a corner office in a redeveloped industrial building in the Pearl District that I had leased just 2 weeks after my termination. Unlike the sleek corporate aesthetic of Westfield Solutions, my new workspace blended exposed brick with modern furniture and an abundance of plants, creating an environment that felt both professional and personally meaningful. On the conference table, I arranged copies of the building maintenance reports, Westfield's lease agreement, and a detailed financial analysis I had prepared showing the company's vulnerability to increased operating costs. I also placed a sealed envelope containing my actual proposal, what I really wanted from Richard in exchange for making his building problems disappear. At precisely 8:59 a.m., my assistant Maya knocked on the door. "Mr. Westfield is here." I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Show him in, please." Richard entered, looking slightly less polished than usual. His tie was perfectly knotted and his suit impeccable, but there was a tightness around his eyes that suggested a restless night. He carried a leather portfolio similar to the one James had brought to our previous meeting. "Emma," he acknowledged, then corrected himself. "Ms. Anderson." "Emma is fine for this meeting," I replied, gesturing to the chair opposite mine at the small conference table. "We've known each other too long for formalities." He nodded and took the seat, placing his portfolio on the table without opening it. For a moment, he simply studied my new office, taking in the awards and certifications displayed on the wall, many earned during my time at Westfield. "Nice space," he finally said. "You've done well for yourself quickly." "Thank you. It suits my needs for the consulting business." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Consulting? I hadn't heard." 3 clients already, I confirmed. Turns out there's significant demand for someone who can translate between technical teams and executive leadership. Richard nodded slowly, understanding the subtle dig. That had been my primary role at Westfield for years, making his grand visions technically feasible and explaining complex technical constraints in terms he could use with clients and investors. I imagine you're very good at that, he conceded. I smiled thinly. I've had extensive practice. We were circling each other verbally, neither quite ready to address the real issues. Richard broke first. You wanted to see the financials, he said, tapping his portfolio. May I ask why before I share confidential company information with someone who's no longer an employee? Of course, I replied smoothly. As the owner of the building housing Westfield Solutions, I need to assess the financial stability of my largest tenant, especially given the rumors circulating about cash flow problems following several failed product launches. Richard's expression tightened. What rumors? Tech communities talk, Richard. Your legacy systems division was generating 60% of company revenue before you dismantled it. The innovation division has had 3 delayed releases in a row. Clients are filing support tickets at twice the previous rate. I leaned forward slightly. I'm concerned about your ability to fulfill the remaining 7 years of your lease obligation. It was a calculated exaggeration. While Westfield was indeed facing challenges, I had no concrete evidence they were in financial jeopardy. But Richard didn't know what information might have reached me through my network of former colleagues. He sighed, then opened his portfolio and slid several documents across the table. Our financials are solid. Revenue is up 12% year over year, even with the recent challenges. I took the papers and scanned them quickly. The numbers were better than I had expected, though I noticed several accounting maneuvers designed to present the most favorable picture possible. And the Meridian Tech acquisition talks? I asked casually. How are those progressing? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, but he recovered quickly. Positively, we're in late-stage discussions. I nodded, continuing to review the financial statements. And what value are they placing on Westfield? I'm curious what 10 years of building something is worth in their estimation. There it was, the first direct reference to my termination and what had been taken from me. Richard didn't miss it. Emma, he said, his tone softening slightly. I understand you're angry about how things ended. I'm not angry, Richard, I interrupted, looking up from the papers. I'm calculating. That stopped him short. I could almost see him recalibrating his approach, shifting from the placating tone he used with emotional employees to the more cautious stance he took with business adversaries. Calculating what? Exactly? I set the financial statements aside and folded my hands on the table. The value of what I built versus what I received. The cost of breaking promises. The price of loyalty. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with new awareness. And you've determined that ownership of our building gives you the leverage to extract this calculated value? It provides a starting point for a conversation that should have happened years ago, I replied evenly. One about partnership, recognition, and fair compensation. For a long moment, Richard was silent, weighing his options. Finally, he nodded once. All right, Emma. What do you want? Money? A consulting contract with Westfield? Your old job back? I almost laughed at the last suggestion. My old job? No, Richard. I didn't come here to request a demotion. I slid the sealed envelope across the table. This is what I want. Review it. Discuss it with your board if necessary. But understand that the building issues we discussed yesterday will proceed as scheduled unless we reach an agreement. Richard took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. You know, in another circumstance, I might admire this strategy. Using leverage to force a negotiation is exactly what I taught you. You taught me many things, I acknowledged, Some intentionally, others by example. He nodded, accepting the implicit criticism, then opened the envelope and removed the single page inside. I watched his expression as he read my terms, noting the exact moment his eyebrows rose in surprise. "Equity?" he said finally. "After termination?" 20%, I confirmed. Non-dilutable in the event of acquisition, with proportional board representation. "This is unprecedented," Richard said, still staring at the document. "So is purchasing the building housing the company that fired you," I countered. "We're in uncharted territory." He set the paper down carefully. "The board would never approve this." "They might if you explain the alternatives." I gestured to the lease documents on the table. Ongoing building issues during acquisition talks. Potential relocation costs if you break the lease. The PR implications if the real story behind my termination became public. Richard's jaw tightened. "That sounds like a threat." "It's a realistic assessment of your options," I corrected him. "And there's more to my proposal than just equity." Richard glanced back at the document. "Yes, I see that. You want public acknowledgement of your role in building Westfield's core products. Your name added retroactively to patent applications, where you contributed, a seat on the technical advisory board even after acquisition. Recognition for work I actually did," I said simply. "Nothing more." He studied me for a long moment. "You really believe you deserve all this?" "I know I do," I replied without hesitation. "The question is whether you're willing to acknowledge it." Richard carefully refolded the document and returned it to the envelope. "I'll need to discuss this with the board and with the Meridian Tech representatives." I nodded, having expected this response. "You have 48 hours. 48 hours, Richard repeated incredulously. "Emma, this kind of negotiation could take weeks. You have 48 hours before the HVAC work begins on your main floor," I reminded him. "The floor where you're planning to host the Meridian Tech executive team next week." Richard's expression hardened. "You're really willing to jeopardize the acquisition over this? An acquisition that would increase the value of any equity you might receive?" "I'm willing to ensure I receive fair value for my contributions," I replied evenly. "The timing is unfortunate, but not my primary concern." He stood gathering his portfolio. "I'll call you tomorrow." "I look forward to it," I said, remaining seated. "Oh, and Richard, come alone next time. This is between us." After he left, I sat at the conference table for several minutes, replaying our interaction and analyzing his responses. Richard had been surprised by my demands, but not shocked. On some level, he recognized the legitimacy of my claim to equity and recognition. He just hadn't expected to have to pay it. I had given him 48 hours, but I knew his real deadline was tighter. The Meridian Tech team was visiting in 5 days, and Richard needed the building issues resolved before then. He would need to make a decision by tomorrow, regardless of whether the board had fully deliberated. In the meantime, I had my consulting business to build and my broader strategy to implement. While putting pressure on Richard through the building, ownership was satisfying. It was only one component of my plan. I needed to establish myself as a force in the industry independent of Westfield Solutions, someone whose value extended beyond my former role. That afternoon, I met with Kavita Patel, the CTO of a rapidly growing fintech company called Nexus Financial. We had crossed paths at industry events over the years, and she had reached out after seeing my name mentioned in a tech newsletter. "The word is getting around that you're available for consulting," Kavita said as we settled at a corner table in a quiet cafe, "and that your expertise goes far beyond what Westfield allowed you to showcase publicly." I smiled, pleased that my network was already spreading the right messages. "Word travels fast, especially when someone of your caliber suddenly becomes available," Kavita replied. "I'll be direct, Emma. We're building a new payment processing system that needs to scale globally while maintaining strict security and regulatory compliance. We need someone who understands both the technical architecture and the business implications. That sounds exactly like the kind of challenge I enjoy, I said honestly. What's your timeline? As Kavita outlined their project, I found myself genuinely engaged in a way I hadn't felt in my final months at Westfield. Without Richard's constraints or James's interference, I could offer solutions that balanced innovation with practicality, drawing on my years of experience while incorporating new approaches. By the end of our meeting, I had secured my fourth consulting client, this one with a 6-month contract at a rate that exceeded my former Westfield salary. More importantly, Nexus was a direct competitor to one of Westfield's newer financial service products, the ones James had been so eager to develop. On my way back to the office, I received a call from Deanna at MediSync. "Emma, we need to increase your hours. The team has made more progress in the 2 weeks you've been consulting than in the previous 3 months." "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, "but I'm careful about overcommitting." "What specifically do you need?" "Strategic direction on the security architecture," Deanna explained. "And honestly, some help managing the development team. The lead engineer is brilliant but struggling with the management aspects." I thought for a moment. I could offer an additional day each week, but I'd want to bring in a security specialist I trust for the implementation details. "Done!" Deanna agreed immediately. "Who did you have in mind?" I smiled to myself. "Alex Chen. He was my senior security architect at Westfield until 2 weeks ago." There was a pause as Deanna connected the dots. "You're poaching from your old company?" "Not actively," I clarified. "Alex reached out to me after I left. He's been dissatisfied with recent management changes." "I see," Deanna said, a note of amusement in her voice. "Well, if he's available, we'd be happy to discuss consulting arrangements with him as well." By that evening, I had messaged Alex about the opportunity. His response came within minutes. "Very interested. James reassigned me to payment processing security last week. Hate it. When can we talk?" I smiled at my phone, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Alex was just the first. There were at least 5 other key technical staff at Westfield, who were growing increasingly frustrated under the new management structure. I wasn't actively recruiting them. I didn't need to. They were reaching out to me, drawn by the reputation I had built and the opportunities I could now offer outside Westfield's constraints. The next morning, Maya knocked on my office door. "Richard Westfield is calling. He says it's urgent." I glanced at my watch. Barely 9 a.m., a full day before our agreed deadline. "Put him through." When I picked up the phone, Richard skipped the pleasantries. "We need to meet today." "I'm available at 3, I replied calmly. "Emma, this is time sensitive." 3 o'clock, Richard, I repeated firmly. "At my office." A pause, then a resigned sigh. "Fine, 3 o'clock." I spent the intervening hours refining my consulting proposal for Nexus Financial and having a productive video call with Alex about the MediSync security architecture. By the time Maya announced Richard's arrival at precisely 3 p.m., I was centered and focused. Richard entered looking noticeably more strained than during our previous meeting. He carried a different portfolio, this one bearing the Westfield Solutions logo, and moved with an urgency that suggested he had news he considered significant. "Thank you for seeing me," he said as he took the same seat as before. No pleasantries, no small talk, straight to business. This was the Richard I remembered from difficult client negotiations. "Of course," I replied evenly. "You're a day early. I assume that means you've made a decision regarding my proposal." Richard opened his portfolio and removed a document that appeared to be a modified version of the terms I had presented. "The board met this morning. We have a counteroffer." I took the document and began reviewing it carefully. The equity offer had been reduced to 15%, still substantial, but less than I had demanded. The board seat was replaced with an advisory role. The patent acknowledgments remained intact, as did the public recognition of my contributions. "This is their best offer?" I asked, setting the paper down. "It is," Richard confirmed. 15% is significant, Emma. It would make you the third largest individual shareholder after myself in the venture capital group. I nodded, conceding the point. "And the Meridian Tech acquisition? How does this affect those discussions?" Richard hesitated, then said, "We informed them of the situation. They're concerned about governance instability, but they understand that resolving past equity issues before acquisition is sometimes necessary." Translation: Meridian wasn't happy about a last-minute equity recipient, but was willing to proceed if it cleared potential complications from the deal. "And the building issues?" Richard continued. "If we reach agreement on these terms, I assume those will be reprioritized?" "The necessary maintenance will still happen," I clarified, "but we can certainly adjust the scheduling to minimize disruption to your operations and client meetings." Richard relaxed slightly, taking this as a positive sign. "Then we have a deal?" I studied him for a moment, noting the eagerness beneath his professional demeanor. He wanted this resolved quickly, which meant there was something he wasn't telling me. "Before I agree," I said carefully, "I'd like to understand the current status of the Meridian acquisition more clearly. What stage are the discussions actually in?" Richard's expression flickered briefly, a tell I recognized from years of negotiating alongside him. "As I mentioned, we're in late-stage talks." "How late?" I pressed. He sighed, recognizing that I had caught something. "They've made a formal offer. We're scheduled to sign the preliminary agreement next week, after their executive visit." This was significant new information. If a formal offer was already on the table, the acquisition was much further along than Richard had previously indicated. The timing of my termination suddenly made more sense. They had cleared me out just before finalizing the deal, ensuring I wouldn't complicate the negotiations or claim a larger share of the acquisition value. "I see," I said, tapping my finger thoughtfully on the counter proposal. "And what's the valuation they've offered?" Richard hesitated again, clearly reluctant to share this detail. "Richard," I said firmly, "if I'm considering accepting 15% equity, I need to know what that actually represents." Finally, he named a figure that made my breath catch. Meridian's offer valued Westfield Solutions at nearly 3 times what I had estimated based on the financial statements Richard had shown me. "That's sure impressive," I acknowledged, quickly calculating what 15% would be worth in the acquisition. "It's a strong validation of what we've built," Richard said, emphasizing the "we" in a way that felt calculated. "And it reflects the value of the core products you helped develop." I nodded slowly, processing this new information. The counteroffer was actually more valuable than I had anticipated given the acquisition price. However, the fact that Richard had withheld the acquisition timeline and valuation during our previous meeting reinforced my instinct not to trust him fully. "I have one additional condition," I said finally. "The equity transfer must happen immediately, not contingent on the acquisition closing. And I want observer rights for all remaining acquisition discussions." Richard frowned. "Emma, that's not standard practice for—" "This isn't a standard situation," I interrupted. "You terminated me weeks before an acquisition that would have significantly benefited from my years of contribution. Either I'm involved in the final discussions as a significant shareholder, or the building issues proceed as originally scheduled." We stared at each other across the table, the tension palpable. Finally, Richard nodded once. "I'll need to call the board chair, but I believe they'll agree to those terms to keep the acquisition on track." "Good," I said. "While you make that call, I'll have my lawyer review the counter proposal." Richard stepped outside to make his call while I contacted Morgan. 20 minutes later, with verbal agreement from the board chair and Morgan's preliminary approval of the terms, we had reached a deal. Richard looked visibly relieved as we shook hands. "I'll have the legal team prepare the final documents for signing tomorrow," he said. "And I'll inform the building management that we've resolved our concerns." "Not quite yet," I cautioned. "The HVAC work remains on schedule until the equity transfer is complete and the agreement is signed by all parties." Richard's relief faded slightly, but he nodded in understanding. "Of course. Trust but verify." As he prepared to leave, Richard paused at the door. "You know, in a strange way, I'm impressed, Emma. This was masterfully handled." "Thank you," I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the compliment. "If circumstances had been different," he continued, "you would have made an excellent CEO." I smiled thinly. "Circumstances are of our own making, Richard. Remember that." After he left, I sat at my desk processing what had just transpired. I had secured significant equity in Westfield just before a major acquisition, obtained public recognition for my contributions, and established my presence in the decision-making process moving forward. By any objective measure, I had won. Yet it felt incomplete somehow. The equity and recognition were tangible victories, but they didn't address the underlying issue: Richard's willingness to discard people once they had served their purpose. He had agreed to my terms not because he believed they were right, but because I had leveraged circumstances to force his hand. I picked up my phone and dialed Olivia. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "Successfully," I replied. "We've reached an agreement. 15% equity, patent acknowledgments, public recognition, and observer rights for the acquisition discussions." "Emma, that's incredible," Olivia exclaimed. "Congratulations." "Thank you," I said, still sorting through my mixed feelings. "Would you mind rescheduling the HVAC work for next month? We'll keep the elevator maintenance as planned, but with less disruptive hours." "Of course," Olivia agreed. "So, this is it? You've got what you wanted?" I hesitated before answering. "I've secured fair compensation for my work, but I'm realizing there's something more important than equity or recognition." "What's that?" "Building something that truly reflects my values," I said, the idea crystallizing as I spoke. Westfield will always be Richard's company, shaped by his priorities and leadership style. Even with 15% equity and an advisory role, I'll never be able to change its fundamental nature. "So what's your next step?" Olivia asked. I glanced at my calendar, noting the meeting scheduled with my consulting clients for the next day. Exactly what I've been doing, building my reputation, gathering talented people who share my values, and establishing my own vision for what a technology company can be. "You're going to start your own company," Olivia concluded, not as a question but as a realization. "Eventually," I confirmed. "Not immediately. I need time to develop the right concept and assemble the right team. But yes, that's the logical next step." "Well," Olivia said, a smile evident in her voice, "when you're ready to lease office space, I know a good property manager." I laughed, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. "You'll be my first call." The next day, the equity transfer. Documents were prepared, reviewed by Morgan, and signed by all parties. By 5 p.m., I was officially a significant shareholder in Westfield Solutions, with observer rights for all acquisition discussions and board meetings. The maintenance schedules for the Burton building were adjusted as promised, ensuring Westfield's operations would continue smoothly through the Meridian Tech visit and acquisition process. That evening, I received a text from Marcus, my former team lead at Westfield. "Heard the news about your equity stake. Office is buzzing. Many happy to see you get recognition. Can we talk tomorrow? Have some ideas I want to run by you." Soon after, similar messages arrived from 3 other key technical staff at Westfield. all expressing support for my new role and hinting at dissatisfaction with the current direction under James and Richard. I replied to each, scheduling coffee, meetings over the next week. These weren't recruitment conversations, at least not yet, but they were the beginning of something more significant, a network of talented professionals who recognized that there could be a better way to build technology and run a company. The following Monday, I attended my first acquisition meeting as a Westfield shareholder. Richard introduced me to the Meridian Tech executives with a carefully crafted explanation about my historic contributions to the company and my continuing role as a technical advisor. If they were surprised by my sudden appearance in the process, they hid it well. As I sat observing the discussions, taking notes but rarely speaking, I noticed Richard repeatedly glancing in my direction whenever key technical details were mentioned. He knew that I understood the products better than anyone else in the room, including himself and James. My presence was both a reminder of his vulnerability and an insurance policy against technical misrepresentations. During a break, one of the Meridian executives approached me. "Ms. Davis, I've been following your recent articles on software architecture. Very insightful. If you're ever interested in opportunities beyond consulting, I'd love to have a conversation." I thanked him politely, filed away the contact for future reference, and returned to the meeting with renewed perspective. I had secured my rightful recognition and compensation from Westfield, but that was just the beginning. The real opportunity lay ahead, not in fighting old battles, but in building something new that truly reflected my vision and values. Richard had taught me many lessons over our 10 years together, some intentional and others by painful example. Perhaps the most valuable was this: true power doesn't come from a title or even from ownership shares. It comes from creating something of genuine value and surrounding yourself with people who share your commitment to doing things the right way. As the acquisition meeting resumed, I smiled to myself. Richard thought this agreement had resolved our conflict, that the equity and recognition had satisfied my claims. What he didn't understand was that I no longer needed Westfield to define my worth or my future. I had something far more valuable: clarity about the kind of leader I wanted to be and the kind of company I wanted to build. The real work was just beginning. The Meridian Tech acquisition of Westfield Solutions proceeded with meticulous precision over the next 6 weeks. As a significant shareholder with observer rights, I attended every major meeting, reviewed all due diligence documents, and provided input on technical matters when asked. Richard maintained a cordial, professional relationship with me throughout the process, though I could sense his discomfort whenever I pointed out discrepancies in technical claims or timeline projections. James Thornton was less subtle about his feelings. During one particularly tense meeting, after I had corrected his characterization of the payment processing system's capabilities, he leaned over and whispered, "You got what you wanted. Why are you still making this difficult?" I simply smiled and replied, "Accuracy isn't difficult, James. It's essential." The truth was, I wasn't trying to complicate the acquisition. I genuinely wanted it to succeed. My equity stake would be substantially more valuable once the deal closed. But I refused to allow misrepresentations of the technology I had helped build, especially when those misrepresentations might lead to integration problems after the acquisition. Meanwhile, my consulting business was thriving beyond my expectations. What had begun as a temporary measure following my termination was evolving into a substantial enterprise. Within 2 months, I had 7 active clients, a small team of 3 associates I had brought on to help with implementation work, and a growing reputation as someone who could solve the technical problems other consultants couldn't. The irony wasn't lost on me. Richard had fired me from managing legacy systems, yet much of my consulting work involved helping companies modernize their aging infrastructure, precisely the expertise he had devalued. My work with Medisync had been particularly successful. Their patient data platform, which had been stalled for months before I joined, was now in beta testing with select medical practices. Deanna had promoted me from consultant to strategic technical advisor, with a significant increase in my hourly rate and a small equity grant in the company. Most satisfying was that Alex Chen, my former security architect from Westfield, was now working alongside me as a consultant for MediSync and 2 other clients. Alex had officially resigned from Westfield 3 weeks after I began consulting, citing differences in technical vision in his exit interview. He wasn't the only one. Marcus, my former team lead, had left to take a CTO position at a startup. After our coffee meeting, 2 senior developers from the former Legacy Systems division had also departed, both reaching out to me for references and guidance on their next steps. None of these departures were directly my doing. I hadn't actively recruited any of them, but they represented a growing exodus of talent from Westfield that Richard couldn't ignore. This pattern became the primary topic of conversation during an unexpected lunch with Richard at an upscale restaurant near the Burton Building. He had reached out the previous day, asking to meet informally to discuss some concerns outside the acquisition process. I had agreed, curious about what was troubling him enough to seek me out directly. "We've lost 8 key technical staff in the past month," Richard said after we had ordered, getting straight to the point. "All from Legacy Systems teams." I took a sip of water, keeping my expression neutral. "That's unfortunate." "It's more than unfortunate, Emma. It's threatening the acquisition timeline. Meridian is concerned about knowledge transfer if the exodus continues. Have you asked why they're leaving?" I inquired, genuinely curious about Richard's perspective. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration from someone who typically maintained perfect composure. "Exit interviews mention leadership changes, technical direction concerns, loss of mentorship." He met my eyes directly. "Several specifically mentioned your departure as a factor." I nodded, unsurprised. I had built strong relationships with my technical teams over the years, investing in their growth and protecting them from the more unreasonable demands that occasionally came from Richard or clients. "That's not unusual when a long-term leader leaves," I observed, especially under the circumstances of my departure. "Which brings me to why I asked you to lunch," Richard said, leaning forward slightly. "I need your help." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "Meridian has strongly suggested, that we find a way to retain the remaining technical staff until the acquisition is complete and integration is underway. They've proposed extending retention bonuses, but..." He hesitated. "We both know it's not just about money." "What exactly are you asking me to do, Richard?" He took a deep breath. "I'd like you to come back in a temporary capacity as technical integration advisor for the acquisition. Work directly with the teams, reassure them about the transition, help with knowledge transfer to Meridian." I stared at him, momentarily speechless. After everything that had happened, the gradual sidelining, the termination, the building leverage, the forced equity negotiation, Richard was asking me to return and essentially save the acquisition he had pushed me out to facilitate. "You're serious," I said finally. "Completely serious," he confirmed. 3 months, excellent compensation, and Meridian has agreed to consider you for a senior technical role post-acquisition if you're interested." I sat back in my chair, considering the proposal. On a practical level, it made sense. I knew the systems and the people better than anyone. I could certainly help smooth the transition and retention issues. The compensation would be substantial, and a potential role at Meridian could be valuable for my long-term career. But something felt fundamentally wrong about the request. Richard wasn't acknowledging the real issues that had led to this situation. He wasn't taking responsibility for the decisions that had created the exodus in the first place. "Before I consider this," I said carefully, "I need to understand something. Do you recognize what actually caused this problem?" Richard frowned slightly. "Technical staff are always flighty during acquisitions. It's a natural— No, I interrupted, firmly. That's not it. Your technical staff stayed through 2 previous acquisition explorations during my tenure. They're leaving now because you and James systematically dismantled the culture and technical leadership structure that kept them engaged and valued. His expression tightened. Emma, that's not— It is, I insisted. You prioritized acquisition, optics over operational reality. You elevated someone with minimal technical understanding to make decisions about complex systems. You relegated your most experienced staff to legacy status despite their critical contributions. And you fired the person who had built trust with those teams over a decade. Richard was silent for a moment, his jaw working as he processed my words. Finally, he asked, "If that's how you see it, why would you even consider helping?" It was a fair question, one I had been asking myself since he'd made the proposal. Because despite everything, I replied honestly, I care about what happens to the people still there, and because I believe the technology we built deserves proper stewardship during this transition. Richard nodded slowly. So you'll do it? I didn't say that, I corrected him. I have conditions. Of course you do, he said with a small, resigned smile. Let's hear them. First, complete autonomy in working with the technical teams. No management by you or James. I report directly to the Meridian integration lead. Richard nodded. Acceptable. Second, I want a public acknowledgement from you about my role in building Westfield's core technologies. Not just in a press release, but in an all-hands meeting with the full staff present. His expression tightened slightly, but he nodded again. I can do that. Third, I retain all my consulting clients. This would be a part-time engagement, 3 days a week maximum. 2 days would be insufficient, Richard countered. Meridian needs more presence than that. 3 days, but only 6 hours each, I offered, and I choose which days based on my client schedule. Richard considered this, then nodded. We can make that work. Finally, I said, I want a written explanation to the team about why I'm returning and what my role will be. No ambiguity, no misleading characterizations, complete transparency. This last condition seemed to trouble Richard the most. After a moment, he asked, could we draft this explanation together? There are acquisition sensitivities to consider. We can draft it together, I agreed. But the final version must be honest about what happened and why I'm coming back. The team deserves that clarity. Richard took a long drink of water, then set down his glass with careful precision. All right. Emma, I accept your conditions. When can you start? I'll need a week to adjust my client schedules, I replied, and I want the written explanation sent to the team before I appear in the office. Done, Richard agreed, visibly relieved. And thank you. I know this isn't easy given our history. I simply nodded, neither accepting his gratitude nor rejecting it outright. The waiter arrived with our meals, momentarily pausing our conversation. As we ate, Richard attempted to shift to more neutral topics: industry news, Portland's growing, tech scene, mutual acquaintances at other companies. I participated in the conversation politely but maintained an emotional distance. This wasn't a reconciliation lunch. It was a business arrangement. When we finished, Richard insisted on paying the bill. As we walked out of the restaurant, he paused on the sidewalk. Emma, I know you may not believe this, but I do regret how things played out with your departure. I studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus expedient diplomacy. Richard had always been hard to read, a trait that made him an excellent negotiator but a complicated leader. Regret is a starting point, I replied evenly, but it's what we learn from our regrets that matters. He nodded, accepting the implicit challenge in my response. I'll have the contract and announcement draft to you by tomorrow morning. True to his word, the documents arrived in my inbox at 8:15 a.m. the next day. The contract was straightforward. and incorporated all my conditions with appropriate legal language. The draft announcement, however, required significant revisions. Richard's version framed my return as a special advisor for the Meridian integration, without any mention of my previous role or departure. It characterized the arrangement as bringing back valued expertise, but avoided addressing why that expertise had been removed in the first place. I spent an hour reworking the draft, adding clear statements about my previous contributions, acknowledging that my departure had created challenges for team continuity, and explicitly stating that I was returning in a temporary capacity to ensure a smooth transition for the technical staff. I sent the revisions back with a note: "Transparency builds trust. This version does that." After a brief back and forth, we agreed on a final version that, while not as direct as my initial revision, still provided honest context about the situation. The announcement went out to the entire company that afternoon. The responses began flowing in immediately: emails, texts, and LinkedIn messages from current Westfield employees expressing surprise, confusion, and in many cases, cautious optimism about my return. The technical teams were particularly vocal, with several senior developers sending me detailed updates on project statuses and outstanding challenges that had emerged since my departure. The most telling response came from James, who sent a terse email: "Looking forward to coordinating with you during the transition phase. Let's meet to align on messaging." I replied with equal brevity: "Happy to meet. As noted in the announcement, I'll be reporting directly to the Meridian integration lead, but collaboration is always valuable." My first day back at Westfield was surreal. Walking into the Burton building as both a significant shareholder and a temporary advisor, I felt disconnected from my former emotional attachment to the space. The security guard greeted me with surprise. Apparently, my building access had been hastily reinstated that morning and directed me to a visitor badge until my permanent credentials could be reissued. The elevator ride to Westfield's main floor seemed longer than I remembered. When the doors opened, I was greeted by a small group of engineers who had apparently been waiting for my arrival. Their genuine excitement at seeing me was the first moment that truly touched me emotionally since returning. "Conference Room B has been set up as your temporary office," explained Sarah, a senior developer who had been with the company almost as long as I had. "We figured you wouldn't want your old office since..." She trailed off awkwardly. "Since James is now using it," I finished for her with a small smile. "Conference Room B is perfect. Thank you." As we walked through the open office area, heads turned and conversations paused. Some employees smiled and waved, others looked away uncomfortably. I had expected this mixed reaction. My departure and unexpected return had created natural divisions among the staff. The remainder of that first day was consumed by meetings, first with the Meridian integration team, then with key technical leads, and finally, a one-on-one with Richard to establish communication protocols. By the end of the day, I had a comprehensive understanding of the acquisition timeline, the technical challenges facing the integration, and the specific concerns that had led to the recent staff departures. What became immediately clear was that James's innovation division had created significant technical debt in its rush to develop new features. Systems had been built without proper architecture reviews. Security protocols had been bypassed, for the sake of speed, and documentation was woefully inadequate. The technical teams were struggling not just with the uncertainty of the acquisition, but with the practical challenges of maintaining these hastily constructed systems. During my meeting with Richard, I laid out these issues in direct terms. "The technical problems are more extensive than you indicated. Meridian's integration will be substantially more complex than they're expecting." Richard looked genuinely troubled. "How bad is it?" 3 months of focused remediation work. "Before integration can realistically begin," I answered honestly. "And that's assuming we can retain the key staff who understand these systems." He sighed heavily. "Can you fix it?" I almost laughed at the irony of his question. I can help guide the process, but this isn't a one-person job. It requires a complete reprioritization of resources and a pause on all new development. James won't like that, Richard observed. James's preferences aren't relevant to technical reality, I replied firmly. Either we address these issues now, or Meridian discovers them during integration and potentially reconsiders the acquisition. Terms. Richard nodded slowly, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. What do you need from me? Authority to implement a technical freeze on new features and reassign resources to remediation work. He didn't hesitate. You have it. Draft the announcement and I'll send it out tomorrow morning. I left Richard's office that evening with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was satisfying to have my technical judgment validated so completely. On the other, I took no pleasure in the confirmation that Westfield had faltered without my guidance. Real people's jobs and livelihoods were at stake if the acquisition failed. The next 6 weeks were among the most intense of my professional career. While maintaining my consulting practice 3 days a week, I spent the other 3 working, with Westfield's technical teams to stabilize systems, improve documentation, and prepare for the Meridian integration. James initially attempted to resist the feature freeze and resource reallocation, but Richard held firm, backing my recommendations completely. The technical staff responded remarkably to my return. Morale improved, the pace of departures slowed significantly, and several key developers who had been considering leaving decided to stay through the acquisition. I made no promises about the future under Meridian's ownership, but I did provide honest assessments and guidance based on my interactions with their technical leadership. By week 4, we had addressed the most critical stability issues and established a clear roadmap for the remaining remediation work. The Meridian technical team was now fully engaged, working alongside Westfield's developers to understand the systems and plan the integration approach. It was during this period that I began to see Richard in a slightly different light. Without James constantly at his side, Richard engaged more directly with the technical teams. He attended architecture reviews, asked thoughtful questions, and, most surprisingly, publicly acknowledged mistakes in how the innovation division had been managed. During one particularly challenging meeting about the payment processing system, Richard admitted to the entire room, "We prioritized speed over quality, and that was my decision. I apologize for creating this situation, and I'm grateful to everyone working to address it now." This moment of genuine accountability shocked the room into silence. It wasn't the Richard I had known for 10 years, the one who deflected criticism and reframed failures as strategic pivots. This Richard seemed to be learning from the crisis. After the meeting, I found myself alone with Richard in the conference room, gathering my notes. "That was unexpected," I commented. "The apology." Richard shrugged slightly. "It was true. Sometimes the truth is the only thing that works." "That's a new philosophy for you." He smiled wryly. "Perhaps I'm learning a few things in my old age." I studied him for a moment. "What happened with James? He's been surprisingly absent from these meetings." Richard's expression darkened slightly. "James has been reassigned to focus on client relationships during the transition. Meridian was concerned about his technical oversight once they reviewed the systems more closely." I nodded, understanding the unspoken reality. James was being sidelined. His role in the post-acquisition organization likely diminished significantly. "And you?" I asked. "What's your role going to be after the acquisition?" 6 months as integration advisor, then." He hesitated. "Then I'm out. Meridian wants their own leadership team moving forward." This revelation surprised me. I had assumed Richard would negotiate a substantial role for himself in the combined organization. "That wasn't part of the original deal. Plans change," he said simply. "After seeing the technical issues, Meridian adjusted their approach. I can't really blame them." We sat in silence for a moment. the weight of this information settling. Between us, Richard Westfield, who had built a company from nothing, who had defined himself by his business success, would soon be without the identity that had consumed him for over a decade. "What will you do next?" I asked, genuinely curious. He smiled ruefully. "I don't know yet. Take some time off. Travel maybe. Eventually, probably start something new." He looked at me directly. "What about you? After the 3 months are up?" I considered the question carefully. "My consulting practice is going well. I might continue with that for a while, see where it leads." Richard nodded, then hesitated before asking, "Have you considered starting your own company? You certainly have the expertise and network for—" The question caught me off guard, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because Richard was essentially encouraging me to become his competitor. "I've thought about it," I admitted, "but I'm not in a rush. I want to make sure whatever I build next truly reflects my values and vision." "When you do," Richard said quietly, "I have no doubt it will be exceptional." He gathered his papers and stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Emma, I was wrong about a lot of things, but especially about you." With that, he left, leaving me to consider the strange evolution of our relationship, from mentor and protege to adversaries, to this new, undefined territory of mutual respect tinged with the complicated history we shared. The acknowledgement from Richard was unexpected, but not ultimately what I needed. My worth hadn't changed when he recognized it. I had always been valuable, whether he saw it or not. What had changed was my own understanding of that value and my willingness to demand appropriate recognition for it. As the acquisition process continued over the following weeks, I found myself increasingly focused on the future beyond Westfield. My consulting clients represented diverse industries and challenges, each offering potential directions for a more permanent venture. The technical talent I had connected with, both former Westfield employees and new associates from my consulting work, formed the nucleus of a potential team. Most importantly, I had gained clarity about the kind of organization I wanted to build. One founded on technical excellence, transparent leadership, and genuine respect for the contributions of every team member. The antithesis, in many ways, of what Westfield had become under Richard and James. This clarity was reinforced during a conversation with the Meridian CTO during one of our integration planning sessions. After discussing a particularly complex system architecture issue, he remarked, "You know, if you had been leading the technical direction here all along, this acquisition would be proceeding very differently." "How so?" I asked. "The systems would be better architected, the documentation would be comprehensive, and we wouldn't be scrambling to understand what we're actually acquiring," he replied frankly. "Your 3-week assessment and remediation plan accomplished more than James's division did in 6 months." I acknowledged the compliment with a nod. "The teams here are incredibly talented. They just needed clear direction and the space to do quality work." "That's leadership," he said simply. "Technical skill matters, but knowing how to create an environment where others can excel, that's much rarer." His words stayed with me, crystallizing something I had been feeling but I hadn't fully articulated. My value wasn't just in my technical knowledge or my ability to execute, it was in my approach to leadership and team building. The following week, nearing the end of my contractual period with Westfield, I made a decision. After finishing my consulting appointments for the day, I called Olivia. "Remember when you asked about my next steps?" I began. "I do," she replied. "Have you figured it out?" "I have," I said with newfound certainty. "I'm going to start my own company. Not immediately. I need to finish the Westfield transition and wrap up some consulting projects, but within the next 6 months." "That's fantastic," Olivia exclaimed. "What kind of company?" "Technology solutions focused on industries underserved by current providers. Healthcare, education, nonprofits. sectors where technical expertise is needed, but often inaccessible due to cost or specialized knowledge requirements. Sounds like you've given this some thought, Olivia observed. I have, I confirmed. And I'd like to discuss leasing options in the Burton building once my planning is further along. There was a pause, then Olivia laughed. You want to establish your new company in the same building as Westfield? That's bold, even for you. Westfield won't be Westfield much longer, I reminded her. Once the acquisition closes, they'll be Meridian Portland. And yes, I think there's a certain poetry to building my new venture in the same space where I learned so many valuable lessons, both what to do and what not to do. Well, as your property manager and friend, I'm certainly happy to discuss options when you're ready, Olivia said warmly. The 5th floor has some beautiful spaces opening up in about 4 months, actually. Perfect timing, I replied, already envisioning the possibilities. Let's schedule a tour next month. That night, I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, the Burton building visible in the distance, illuminated against the evening sky. 10 years of my life had been dedicated to building someone else's dream. Now I was poised to build my own. The journey had been unexpected and at times painful, but I wouldn't change it. Every step, from the betrayal of my termination to the leverage of building ownership to the redemption of the acquisition rescue, had taught me something essential about business, leadership, and my own capabilities. Richard had fired me after a decade of loyalty, only to discover I owned the building housing his company. But the true turning point wasn't in that revelation or even in the equity negotiation that followed. It was in the moment I realized that my worth wasn't defined by his validation or by my position in his company. It was defined by what I could create myself, and I was just getting started. 8 months after my termination from Westfield Solutions, I stood in an empty office space on the 5th floor of the Burton building, watching the morning sun illuminate the downtown Portland skyline. The view was similar to the one from my old office 3 floors below, yet everything else had changed. The Meridian acquisition had closed 2 months earlier, transforming Westfield Solutions into Meridian Portland practically overnight. New signage adorned the lobby. Employee badges featured the Meridian logo, and Richard Westfield, the man who had built the company from nothing, had quietly exited after the transition period, just as he had predicted. So, what do you think? Olivia asked, gesturing around the open space. The previous tenant left it in excellent condition, minimal renovation needed. I walked the perimeter of the office, mentally arranging workstations, meeting areas, and collaborative spaces. At 3,500 square feet, it was modestly sized, but perfect for the lean team I envisioned launching with. It's exactly what we need, I confirmed. The natural light is fantastic, and the proximity to downtown clients is ideal. Olivia smiled knowingly. And the fact that it's in the same building as your former company? Just a happy coincidence? I laughed. Let's call it a reminder of lessons learned. Besides, the building has excellent amenities. Speaking of which, Olivia said, checking her phone, the lobby will be completed next week. Your timing is perfect. You'll be the first new tenant after the renovation. This was part of the changes I had initiated as majority owner of Anderson Capital. After the Meridian acquisition stabilized, I had directed our property management company to refresh the Burton building's common areas, modern furnishings in the lobby, upgraded conference facilities, and a small cafe in what had been underutilized space on the ground floor. Have you decided on a company name yet? Olivia asked as we walked back toward the elevator. Keystone Technologies, I replied. We build the essential elements that hold everything else together. I like it. She nodded approvingly. When do you want to sign the lease? Today, if possible. We're incorporating next week, and I'd like to have the office secured. As we rode the elevator down, Olivia studied me with curiosity. You seem different, Emma. More centered somehow. I considered this observation. I feel different. For the first time in my career, I'm building something that completely aligns with my vision and values. There's no compromise. The elevator doors opened on the second floor, where the building management office was located. As we stepped out, I noticed a familiar figure waiting by the reception desk, James Thornton, looking considerably less polished than during his time as Westfield's chief strategy officer. He recognized me immediately, his expression cycling quickly from surprise to discomfort to forced professional courtesy. "Emma, I didn't expect to see you here." "James," I acknowledged with a neutral nod. "How are you?" "Fine," he replied tersely, "just handling some paperwork for my new venture." Olivia stepped forward. "Mr. Thornton is leasing one of our virtual office spaces. We were just about to review the agreement." I maintained a polite expression despite my internal amusement. The virtual offices were small, shared workspaces rented by solo entrepreneurs and tiny startups without the resources for dedicated facilities. A far cry from the corner office James had occupied at Westfield. "Congratulations on your new venture," I said sincerely. Whatever our history, I took no pleasure in anyone's professional struggles. James nodded stiffly. "Thank you. And you? Still consulting?" "Actually, I'm founding a new company," I replied. "We're leasing space on the 5th floor." Something flashed in his eyes, perhaps recognition of the irony that I now occupied a higher floor than Meridian Portland, both literally and figuratively. "Well," he said after an awkward pause, "best of luck with that." "You as well, James." As Olivia led him to her office, I reflected on the strange symmetry of the moment. James had been a key figure in pushing me out of Westfield, yet now he was the one starting over while I was establishing something substantial. There was a lesson there about karma, perhaps, but also about resilience and staying true to one's strengths. Later that afternoon, after signing the lease for Keystone's new office, I met with Alex Chen and Deanna Wong at a cafe near the Burton Building. Both had become central to my plans for the new company, Alex as my prospective chief security officer, and Deanna as our first major client, transitioning from my consulting relationship with MediSync. "The office is officially secured," I announced as I joined them at their table. "We can start moving in next month." "That's fantastic," Alex said, sliding a coffee toward me. "We ordered your usual." "Thanks," I smiled, taking the cup. "So, now that we have a physical location, let's finalize our launch plan." For the next hour, we reviewed the details of Keystone Technologies' initial structure and strategy. Alex had already recruited 2 senior developers from his network, and 3 former Westfield engineers had expressed interest in joining once we were officially established. Deanna had secured approval from MediSync's board to transition their patient data platform project to Keystone as our founding client engagement. Most importantly, we had identified our unique market position, specializing in secure, scalable solutions for organizations in regulated industries with complex compliance requirements. It was a niche where technical excellence was paramount, and where the big tech conglomerates often failed to provide tailored support. "The pitch deck for investors is nearly ready," Deanna noted, showing me the latest version on her tablet. "We're emphasizing your track record with similar systems at Westfield and through your consulting practice." I nodded, reviewing the slides. "It looks good. I want to be transparent about our startup status while still highlighting our collective experience." "About funding," Alex interjected. "How much of your Westfield acquisition payout are you planning to invest initially?" It was a reasonable question. When the Meridian acquisition had closed, my 15% equity stake had converted to a substantial sum, enough to fund Keystone comfortably for at least a year, even without additional investment or revenue. "I'm committing half of it," I replied. "Enough to demonstrate my confidence in our vision while maintaining a personal safety net. The rest will come from the investment group Olivia introduced me to, plus revenue from initial clients like MediSync." Alex and Deanna exchanged glances, clearly impressed by the commitment. In the startup world, founders often tried to minimize their personal financial risk while maximizing ownership. My approach signaled both my belief in our potential and my desire to maintain control over the company's direction. "Have you heard from Richard at all?" Deanna asked, changing the subject. "Since the acquisition closed?" I shook my head. "Not directly. I heard from Marcus that he's traveling. Southeast Asia, I think. Taking time to decompress before deciding what's next." "Do you think he'll start another company?" Alex wondered. "Eventually," I replied. "It's in his nature to build things, but I think he needed space to reflect on the Westfield experience." Our meeting concluded with clear next steps for each of us. Alex would finalize employment offers for our initial technical team, Deanna would prepare the client agreement for MediSync, and I would complete the investor presentation scheduled for the following week. As I walked back to my condo that evening, I found myself thinking about the journey that had led to this moment. If Richard hadn't fired me, if I hadn't purchased the Burton building, if the sequence of events hadn't unfolded exactly as it had, Keystone Technologies might never have existed. Sometimes, what appears to be your lowest moment becomes the foundation for something greater. The next month passed in a blur of activity. The incorporation paperwork for Keystone Technologies was finalized. Our office space was furnished and equipped, and our core team of 7, including me, Alex, and 5 senior engineers, began working together in our new headquarters. Our investor presentations went even better than anticipated. My reputation in the Portland tech community, combined with the impressive backgrounds of our founding team and the commitment from MediSync as our first client, attracted investment offers that exceeded our initial funding targets. We were selective, choosing partners who aligned with our vision of sustainable growth and technical excellence over those pushing for rapid scaling at any cost. The most unexpected opportunity came through Olivia, who mentioned during a building management meeting that the Burton building's internal systems were overdue for modernization. The security infrastructure, tenant management software, and environmental controls were all installed 15 years ago, she explained. Anderson Capital has approved a budget for comprehensive upgrades, but we're struggling to find a vendor who can handle the integrated approach we need. I immediately recognized the potential. Keystone could develop a proposal. Building management systems aren't our primary focus, but the security and integration challenges align with our expertise. Olivia laughed. Would that be strange, working on the systems in your own building? Not at all, I replied. Actually, it's perfect. We're on site for implementation and support. We understand the building's needs as tenants ourselves, and it would be a showcase project we could demonstrate to future clients. 2 weeks later, after a formal proposal, process that I insisted upon for transparency, Keystone Technologies secured its second major client, Anderson Capital LLC, my own property management company. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved, but the decision made business sense for both entities. As Keystone grew steadily over the following months, adding 2 more clients and expanding our team to 12, I maintained my ownership in the Burton building through Anderson Capital. The arrangement created an unusual but advantageous situation. I was simultaneously a tenant, a service provider, and the majority owner of the building housing my company. This unique positioning became a conversation point during a tech industry panel where I was invited to speak about entrepreneurship and second acts in one's career. When the moderator asked about the unconventional path that led to founding Keystone, I shared the story of being fired after 10 years and subsequently revealing my ownership of the building. The lesson wasn't about revenge, I explained to the audience. It was about recognizing your true value outside of someone else's validation. Sometimes we invest years building other people's visions because we underestimate what we could create ourselves. The panel was recorded and excerpts were shared widely across professional social networks. In the days that followed, my inbox filled with messages from people sharing similar experiences of professional betrayal and reinvention. Many asked for advice about starting over after career setbacks or navigating transitions between employment and entrepreneurship. One message stood out from the others. An email sent late one evening from an address I didn't immediately recognize. "Emma," it began, "I saw your panel discussion online. You articulated something I've been struggling to understand about my own journey. If you're open to it, I'd value the opportunity to buy you coffee and hear more about Keystone's approach. I'm back in Portland after 6 months of reflection and considering my next chapter. Richard." I stared at the message for several minutes, surprised not by Richard's return to Portland, but by the humility in his tone. The Richard Westfield I had known for a decade would have approached such a conversation as a power player, offering guidance to a less experienced entrepreneur, not as someone seeking insights. After careful consideration, I replied with a time and place for coffee the following week. Whatever our complicated history, I was curious about his perspective now that we had both experienced significant transitions. We met at a small cafe, equidistant from the Burton Building and Richard's new apartment in the Pearl District. He arrived exactly on time, dressed more casually than I had ever seen him during our Westfield years. Dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt rather than his customary suit. "Emma?" he greeted me with a genuine smile. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Of course," I replied, gesturing to the chair opposite mine. "How was your traveling?" "Illuminating," he said as he sat down. "Thailand, Vietnam, Japan. I had never taken more than a week away from work since founding Westfield. The perspective was necessary." A server approached, and we ordered our drinks. When they departed, Richard continued. "I watched your entire panel discussion. You've built something impressive with Keystone already." "We're still early stage," I said modestly, "but the foundation is solid." Richard nodded. "That's what interested me most, your emphasis on foundation and values. You mentioned creating a company that reflects your vision without compromise. That's not the approach I took with Westfield." His candor surprised me. The Richard I had known rarely acknowledged shortcomings in his business philosophy. "Westfield reflected your priorities," I observed neutrally. "Growth, prestige, acquisition potential." "Yes," he agreed readily. "And that strategy succeeded on its own terms. But watching how quickly it all transformed after the acquisition, the culture we built erased in weeks, the technologies we developed absorbed or discarded based on Meridian's priorities. It raised questions about what success really means." Our drinks arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. I used the moment to study Richard more carefully. Beyond the casual clothing, there was something different in his demeanor, a thoughtfulness that had often been obscured by his driving ambition. "What are you planning next?" I asked after taking a sip of my coffee. Richard smiled wryly. "That's the question, isn't it? Financially, I don't need to work again. The acquisition provided more than enough security. But purpose is another matter entirely." "You're not the retiring type," I noted. "No," he admitted. "I've been evaluating options. Venture capital, mentoring at the technology incubator, potentially founding something new. But I wanted to understand your perspective first." "My perspective on what exactly?" "On building something that lasts," he replied simply. "Something defined by values rather than just valuation." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Richard Westfield, who had once measured success primarily in acquisition multiples and growth percentages, was genuinely seeking guidance on creating something with deeper meaning. "I'm still figuring that out myself," I said honestly. "Keystone is only 6 months old, but I can tell you what we're attempting to do differently." For the next half hour, I shared the principles guiding Keystone's development, our commitment to technical excellence over superficial features, our transparency with clients about timelines and capabilities, our approach to team building, that emphasized sustainable workloads and professional growth. Richard listened attentively, occasionally asking insightful questions that demonstrated he was truly engaging with the concepts rather than just being polite. "You've created a model that reflects who you are," he observed when I finished. "That's what I failed to do with Westfield. I built what I thought the market wanted rather than what represented my best vision." "It's not too late to change that approach," I pointed out. He nodded thoughtfully. "That's why I wanted to meet. I'm considering starting a foundation focused on expanding access to technical education, helping people from underrepresented backgrounds enter the industry with practical skills and mentorship." This was unexpected. Richard had never shown particular interest in educational initiatives or diversity efforts during our Westfield years. "That's not what I would have predicted for your next venture," I said carefully. Richard smiled. 6 months of reflection changes perspectives. I realized that my greatest satisfaction at Westfield came from watching people grow into their potential, something you were actually much better at fostering than I was. The acknowledgement was generous and, I suspected, difficult for him to articulate, given our history. "A foundation could make a significant impact with the right approach," I said, "though the challenges are different from running a technology company." "True," Richard agreed, "which is why I'm consulting with education experts and community organizations before finalizing anything. I'd actually value your input as well if you're willing. Your experience building teams from diverse backgrounds would be relevant." I considered his request. A year ago, I might have declined immediately, still processing the hurt of my termination. 6 months ago, during the tense negotiation over my equity stake, I would have been suspicious of his motives. But now, with Keystone flourishing and my own path clearly established, I could evaluate the request on its merits. "I'd be happy to review your plans once they're more developed," I offered. "Education initiatives align with Keystone's values as well. We might find areas for collaboration." Relief and something like gratitude crossed Richard's face. "Thank you, Emma. That means more than you might realize." As our conversation drew to a close, Richard hesitated, then asked, "Would it be inappropriate to inquire about leasing options in the Burton building? The foundation will need office space eventually, and there's a certain symmetry to returning there in a different capacity." I smiled at the irony. "Not inappropriate at all. The 3rd floor has space opening. Up next quarter, I can connect you with Olivia." "That would be perfect," Richard said, then added with surprising humor, "Though I assume rental rates have increased under the new ownership." "Market adjustments," I replied with a matching smile. "Nothing personal." We parted ways with a handshake that felt like the closing of one chapter and the potential opening of another. Not as boss and employee, not as adversaries, but as peers with a shared history and distinct futures. Walking back to the Burton building, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 10 years of building someone else's dream had ultimately led to the creation of my own. The building that had once represented my professional cage now housed my vision for the future. The relationship that had defined my career for a decade had transformed into something neither of us could have predicted. There was a profound lesson in it all, about resilience, about recognizing your own value, about the unexpected ways that setbacks become opportunities. Richard firing me had been painful in the moment, but it had pushed me to create something that truly reflected my values and capabilities. As I entered the Burton building lobby, now beautifully renovated under Anderson Capital's direction, I glanced at the directory board. Keystone Technologies, Suite 510, was displayed prominently, alongside Meridian Portland on the lower floors. Soon, Richard's foundation might join the list of tenants, adding another layer to our intertwined professional stories. I took the elevator to the 5th floor, to the office where my team was building something meaningful, something that would last beyond any potential acquisition or market shift. Through the glass doors, I could see Alex and 2 developers huddled, Around a whiteboard, working through a complex architecture problem with the focused enthusiasm that had become Keystone's hallmark. This was success, not measured in exit strategies or valuation multiples, but in the creation of something authentic and valuable. My boss had fired me after 10 years, then found out I owned the building where his company operated. But the real victory wasn't in that moment of revelation, or even in the equity negotiation that followed. The victory was in what came afterward. The company I built, the team I assembled, the values I refused to compromise. The true power had never been in the building itself, but in recognizing my worth and creating something that fully expressed it. Sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you. Sometimes it's the beginning of discovering who you really are. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.